Last month, the United Nations released a report saying there has been a dramatic increase in extreme weather events in the past 20 years. The number of major floods, for example, more than doubled. While better reporting may explain some of the increase, it says the warming climate is the main reason. Now that governments are spending money to strengthen the economy, there's a push to focus on green projects that can not only create jobs, but also lessen our environmental impact. And today we are asking what green ideas you'd like to see businesses and governments invest in. What can individuals do to lower our environmental footprint? And how do we better prepare for extreme weather events? You can get in touch now. Our number is 1-800-565-1940. Our email is marnoon@cbc.ca, and we're on Twitter @CBC Maritime Noon. My guest today is Blair Feltmate. He is head of the Intact Center of Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. He's also a former chair of a federal expert panel on climate change adaptation and resilience. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
To what degree would you say the coronavirus has forced discussions about climate crisis to the backseat?
Well, it's basically, it has done exactly that. Right now, it's very difficult to get attention on the climate file when you're meeting with senior levels of government, federally, provincially, municipally, even business leaders and others. It's almost a little bit like if a conversation doesn't start with COVID, they're not interested. And by the way, I'm not criticizing that. I understand that there's an immediate problem on the doorstep, but it certainly has pushed the climate file to the back seat a little bit for the immediate term. But the bad part of that is climate change doesn't care about COVID, period. So it's still there and the challenges are increasing.
Well, because of COVID, as I said, many governments are trying to stimulate their economies. And there are some people that think this could be a golden opportunity to funnel some of the money into green technologies, get green projects underway. Do you see this as a really significant period?
Yes, and it really relates to your opening comments that the formidability of the climate file, the climate challenges, it is increasing through expressions of whether it's flood, drought, fire, hail, wind, snow load, sea level rise, permafrost loss. There's various forms of manifestation of climate change extreme weather risk that are getting more challenging all the time. And perhaps one of the lessons that emerges from COVID is that not being prepared is not the place you want to be. So we have to prepare for this stuff. We have to prepare rapidly.
All right. It's not that, the federal government, for example, hasn't set out targets. The Liberals have pledged to exceed Canada's 2030 emissions reduction standards. So that's by 30% below the 2005 levels. They've legislated targets to reach net zero emissions by 2050. They want to plant 2 billion trees by the year 2030. They're being criticized, though, because a lot of people are still looking for the details of those initiatives. What's your sense of how fast the government is moving to address climate change?
I look at the government's direction on climate change. There's a positive story and maybe not so positive story. The good news is, have we laid out pretty good plans that, if followed, would help mitigate overall greenhouse gas emissions or the release of greenhouse gas emissions? The answer is yes. That's a good path to be on. Number two, we have very good ideas and direction and standards and guidelines that have been developed over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years in Canada as to how to mitigate extreme weather risk when it manifests. And that is flooding and in particular in the areas of flooding and fires. Those are the two biggest costs to Canada by far due to climate change. It's flooding and fires, affecting homes, businesses, and communities in forested regions for the fires. So the good news is we have very good direction laid out as to what we need to pursue to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for extreme weather risk that's on the ground today and the greater risk that's coming in the future. The bad news is, in my opinion at least, is we're not moving quick enough on deploying measures to mitigate these risks. The urgency that needs to be attached to the deployment of these measures, in my opinion, is not there. So the good news is we know what to do. The bad news is we're not doing it fast enough.
Okay, and we want to know from our listeners today what to do as well on the efforts to reduce our footprint. But on the protection side of things, as Maritimers, what can we be doing to sort of at least lessen the impact of severe storms?
So flooding is particularly problematic in the Maritime provinces. It is for Canada as a whole, but particularly in the Maritimes. And going forward projections for Canada are that it's going to get hotter and wetter in eastern Canada. So Maritimers need to prepare at a variety of levels for the flooding that's coming. Number one, in and around people's homes, there's a tremendous amount they can do just to prepare the home around the outside of the property and in the basement itself to make it such that when the big storms hit, the chances of people ending up with a basement full of sewer water or flood water is much lower. In reference to building new communities, we need to embrace practices to make sure that new communities that are being built aren't being built in harm's way. Number one, don't build on floodplains. For existing communities, for those communities, they need to deploy measures to identify where are the areas of high risk or vulnerability to flooding when the big storms come, and then embrace measures to direct water to safe locations or keep people out of harm's way or building and infrastructure out of harm's way when the big storms hit. So how can we use berms, diversion channels, holding ponds, cisterns, bioswales, permeable surfacing, these types of structures that can be put in place to send water to safe locations when the big storms hit. So we're not all running out at the last minute putting out hundreds of thousands of sandbags to hold the water back. And then in Canada right now, and this is a work in progress, we're developing a guideline, a standard for shoreline or coastline resiliency that will take into account the challenges of sea level rise combined with king tide combined with storm surge. And when that direction comes out in less than a year from now, in the coastal regions, particularly of Nova Scotia, those measures should be deployed because sea level rise is going to be particularly problematic in the area of Nova Scotia.
We're told you can't tie any one individual weather event to climate change, that you have to look over a period of time and look at trends before you can make that correlation. Is the link solid there? Is the evidence that you're looking at make it clear that there is a strong link?
Yeah, there certainly is a strong link, but it is correct. You can't say that any single extreme weather event is attributable to climate change. But I sort of liken it by analogy to the equivalency of if you looked at a baseball player who went on steroids and all of a sudden started hitting 5 times as many home runs. You can't say that any particular home run it may be attributable to the steroids, but if all of a sudden you're hitting 5 times as many home runs, you say, well, there certainly seems to be cause and effect going on here. And right now, we've got climate change on steroids with elevated greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. But there are other factors that can affect flooding. For example, we've lost a tremendous amount of natural infrastructure that was originally in southern Canada 100 years ago. Depending on the province, we've lost about 60 to 80% of natural infrastructure that was originally here, the forest, the fields, the wetlands, that's either been paved over or turned into some form of agricultural development. And when storms hit those areas, when water hits pavement, it just runs off immediately to the lowest location, usually somebody's basement, and that can affect flooding. So it's not just climate change, it's loss of natural infrastructure, it's aging municipal infrastructure, it's aging housing infrastructure. There's a combination of factors that are at play here, but certainly climate change is a big player in that equation.
All right. Well, today we're asking what green ideas you'd like to see businesses and governments invest in. What can we do as individuals to lower our environmental footprint? And how do we better prepare for extreme weather events? 1-800-565-1940 is the number. And our email is marnoon@cbc.ca. Let's go to the phone lines. Dave Stewart is on the line from Dartmouth. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
Hi. Any green ideas you'd like to share?
Well, my question to the general population here is, what is our fascination with very large trucks, SUVs, and the fact that you can't seem to find any small sedans anymore? In fact, that Volkswagen has basically decide not to bring in the new Golf or the ID3 Golf because of the market. But I'm going, well, 1/3 of the market is pickup trucks, 1/3 of the market is SUVs, and 1/3 of the market is sedans. Would a higher price on fuel do something? I know that's pretty sacrilegious, but what's this fascination with pickup trucks? And I think that is a personal responsibility.
Okay, Blair, influencing consumer trends as a way to address this issue. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the point that's brought up is very good. Part of what the federal government is trying to do is influence consumer trends or purchasing decisions by attaching a cost to carbon. For example, right now, in Canada, we realize a cost on carbon of about $30 per ton. Next year, it will go up to $40 per ton. And by 2022, it will be $50 per ton. So what does that mean relative to driving or a vehicle? At $50 per ton, that translates through to an increase per liter of gasoline to about 10 to 11 cents per liter. So that means if you fill up a vehicle with 60 or 70 liters, it might cost you an extra $6 or $7. Or a very large vehicle, it might be, twice that much, 10 or 12 or $15. So the question is, would that be a behavioral deterrent? Would that make somebody question when they're buying a vehicle, each time that they're going to fill up a large vehicle versus a smaller one, that they're paying an extra $12 or $15 per tank? Would that deter them or not? If you filled up, on a Monday and then didn't do so again until a Friday, I'm not sure that would be a major deterrent. But that it remains to be seen. However, if the government tried to put a higher price tag on carbon, it would get shot down very, very quickly. So the dollar values that are attached to the cost of carbon right now, I think are, pushing the limits of what Canadians would consider acceptable. And, so hopefully that will make some element of adjustment in consumer purchasing practices.
To jump in there and say, if there was a stronger incentive for going to electric vehicles, for instance, Ontario, BC, and Quebec have very aggressive provincial incentives to do it. We should have provincial incentives here. And the fact of the matter is that when Volkswagen brings in their ID4, they're only going to release it first in Ontario, Quebec, and BC, and we won't see this until 22.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges there is going to, and electric vehicles, I'm fully in favor of them. So the challenge there will be to setting up the infrastructure for charging stations. So this is something that a great deal of emphasis has to be, placed on this in the immediate term. And I think when you look at consumer buying trends and surveys, this seems to be one of the points that's holding people back in reference to buying electric vehicles, is they worry about, well, where do I charge it? And, what's the frequency with which I would encounter charging stations across the province? And then in my personal home, can I charge it? Can I set up a charging station?
Exactly, because if we had the right tax incentives, both from a provincial and a federal level, we'd be able to put photovoltaic panels on a roof, put the charging station on in the house, and then be able to use the electric vehicle as an emergency power supply in the event of extreme weather, which we seem to be talking about.
Yeah, exactly. This is a very good point. As a source of backup generation, this could work exactly as described. So, effectively, I'm in, scream agreement here that we should be promoting electric vehicles, using them as charging stations themselves, battery backup supply, if you will. So the question is, can we do it quickly enough?
Okay, yeah, Dave, thanks for making those points.
You're welcome.
We're talking about ways to address climate change as governments spend money to strengthen the economy during COVID. What would you like to see? Call with your ideas. Our number is 1-800-565-1940 and our email is marnoon@cbc.ca. We're going to get to more people's comments in just a moment. But first, Sandy Smith is standing by with a look at the latest news headlines. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Bob. In New Brunswick, a fire that destroyed a bar in Bactouche early on Tuesday morning has now been deemed suspicious by police. The PEI government has given 5 more childcare centres early years centre designations. That means they'll get some extra money from the province to follow a curriculum and be staffed by trained early childhood educators. And we're waiting for COVID-19 updates from all 4 Atlantic provinces. So far, no new information yet. No update either yet on the U.S. federal election. News in more detail at 1 o'clock, Bob.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. Blair Feltmate is our guest today, professor in environmental studies and head of the Intact Center of Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. 1-800-565-1940 is the number to call. We're going to head right back to the phone lines. Charles Smith is calling from just outside of Fredericton. Hi, Charles.
Good day.
Is that Fredericton PEI or
No,
New Brunswick?
New Brunswick.
All right.
I know the Prime Minister has talked about planting a whole bunch of trees, and they never ever follow up. Like if you plant trees and you don't look after the vegetation that grows faster than the trees you plant, then your trees are going to die. It's the same as a garden. If you plant a garden and you don't take the weeds out of it, you're not going to have much for a crop at the end of the year. You know, you've got to look after those 20 billion trees or whatever they're going to plant, or you're not going to, they're going to die. They can't compete with the weeds and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the Liberal goal is 2 billion trees by the year 2030. Blair, what about that thought? Yes, it's one thing to plant the trees, but it's another one to take care of them and make sure they thrive.
That's right. So the devil is in the details on tree planting programs, and by the way, which I'm a fan of, but it also has to be done right. So there's a lot of factors you have to take into account on tree planting or restoration, and that is, and it starts with planting trees of the right species assemblage that are native to the area that you're planting in. So you want to make sure that if there was pre-cutting down trees, if there was X percentage of white pine and X percentage of sugar maple and whatever it might be, that you, first of all, plant trees in the percentage distributions that occurred in that region originally. Number 2, you want to use a seed bank of trees that actually have the genetic constitution of that area as those trees originally existed there. And because basically, not all white pines are created equal. They have a genetic constitution that is appropriate for the area in which they grow. And then you have to make sure that they're planted in the proper way, interspaced and without competing species, as the caller's mentioning, so that their survivability is high. And if you do all this stuff right, you can have survival rates on tree planting programs in and around, 90%. Like it can be a very, very successful program if done right. But you have to take into account just some of these factors that I'm describing. There's more to it than that. But the intention by the federal government is good. Now the question is, will the execution be correct? And by the way, I'm not saying they're not going to do it correctly. I'm just saying those are some of the factors you have to take into account.
Does that help you, Charles?
Yes, it does. But they plant high-grade trees now in New Brunswick. They don't just take seeds from out in my woodlot. They've high-graded these seeds to make them, whatever they do to them, to make them better. And they still cannot compete with raspberry bushes, poplar trees, black cherry, pin cherry, and all that stuff. That grows faster than the trees we plant. So you've either got to go in with a thinning saw and take those trees out, but by the time you do that with a thinning saw, the high-graded trees that you put in are dead because they can't get the sunlight, or they will grow not straight because they've got to go find a piece of sunlight to get up through. So they might be crooked at the butt.
Okay. Professor Feltmate, sorry, go ahead, Charles.
There's a lot more to this than what people see. They get mad at our forestry companies because they use herbicide. But if you cannot go in and weed your woodlot, it's like you can't weed your woodlot unless you spray those bushes and get the stuff, the overstory off them, to let your stuff you planted grow.
Okay.
You can't go in and pick all the pin cherry and all the popple trees and all the raspberry bushes out of there
Mm-hmm.
and not destroy the little trees you planted. So they have to spray with herbicide.
Okay. Professor Feltmate, the other point when it comes to trees is, yes, they help address some of our emissions, but they also do a lot when it comes to erosion, protecting, you're talking about those high waters and flooding conditions and the like. Trees play a pretty integral role in that kind of work as well.
They play a major role. And for example, in and around streams, we have to make sure that if forestry practices are being engaged, that we leave what are called riparian buffer zones. In other words, large bands of natural vegetation along the edges of flowing water systems, for example, that it's a combination of grasses, plants, trees, that make it such that we don't have erosion right up to the edge of the stream itself. So we want to retain riparian buffer zones. When we cut down trees, we want to make sure that we don't just categorically clear cut areas without leaving bands of vegetation and trees in place that can function both as a seed bank for new growth, but also that you retain a certain amount of the root base that's in the soil to consolidate the soil, such that when the big storms hit, everything doesn't just wash away down into the rivers. So it's sustainable forestry practices is basically the descriptor for all of this, or a component of it. And yeah, trees are not just there, this stuff is not there as decoration on the landscape. Mm-hmm. They sequester carbon, they help limit soil erosion, stream siltation impacts, etc.
Okay, Charles, thanks very much for your thoughts on this today. We appreciate you getting in touch. We're going to jump along to Halifax now. Allison is on the line. Hi, Allison.
Hi.
Hi, do you have some green ideas you'd like governments to invest in as we try to make our way out of COVID-19?
Well, I'm not so sure if I have the idea right there, but I just wanted to make the public aware of my great concern as a teacher that our schools are not recycling paper. They are combining them with garbage. And I'm wondering why the HRCE is not doing enough to have stronger oversight with this practice. It is well known within many schools that paper is amalgamated with garbage at the end of the day. So as an art teacher, I was working at clearing out an art space from the 5 years prior. So there was a lot of old projects done on paper, and I filled up the blue bin within the class. And when I asked the custodians to bring another blue bin, I actually needed a larger one. They brought me a dumpster bin. And so I asked them, where's the blue bin for this? Mm-hmm. And they said, it all just gets added in to the same bin at the end of the day. So it is quite shocking and upsetting that within the school we have a garbage and we have a blue bin for paper, but at the end of the day, they get added to the same bin. And mm-hmm. to me, this is a problem that I really find difficult to stay quiet about.
I have to say, I've seen the same practice at fast food restaurants. In fact, I've spoken to the person who's clearing off the trays, and that's what they say, that yes, there are 3 different places you can put your waste when you finish your meal, but it all ends up in the same place. Professor Feltmate, the thing about recycling is it makes us feel good. But we've also seen, certainly of late, some of the failures of the recycling programs that we have in place.
Yes, and it's idiosyncratic depending on locality. In some areas, they have fairly advanced programs that they can really take recycled, paper and so forth as feedstock for producing new paper, and they can do it quite well, and they have the capacity in place. And then other places, they're simply not equipped at all, and then there's mm-hmm. everything in between. So, the opportunity there, though, is substantial to get better at this. I totally agree.
Absolutely, especially within our schools when we consider the elementary level, the junior high level, and the high school level all around the province. I mean, that really adds up, mm-hmm. And it's concerning. These are messages we're supposed to be sending our children, but right at the source of that message, there's that contradiction.
All right. Well, Allison, thanks for sharing your message today.
Thank you.
Let's jump along to Lunenburg in Nova Scotia. John Harker's on the line. Hi, John.
Hello.
What are your thoughts on green ideas that perhaps we should be investing in, particularly at this time as governments and businesses try to build up the economy?
Yes, indeed, and the two are related. First, though, I want to just say I'm delighted that Blair is your guest. He and I discussed some of these issues many years ago. I do want to emphasize that I live in a small town. Yes, we are surrounded by water and trees, and those things are of vital importance. However, I really think that much more recognition has to be paid to something so far really not attracting too much public attention. It's been established in the last year that perhaps as much as 70% of the carbon emissions which are assaulting our climate and changing it for the worse are not generated by airline travel or a mine or a factory, but rather they emanate from our cities and buildings. And this focus has to really assume much more of our concern. I know that the climate change conference, COP26, was due to have been taking place now. It's been postponed for a year. And hopefully people will understand that that postponement was caused by, yes, you've mentioned it, COVID-19. I understand that trillions of dollars are envisaged now to be required to help the global economy get out from the effects of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. Well, much of that money has to be spent in looking at how our cities and buildings can be good for places for us to work in without continuing to add carbon emissions to our atmosphere. And I think that's, for me, the one issue that Canada could really take a strong lead in. It is, yes, a country of water, a country of trees. It's now heavily urbanized, and we have for years had good governmental structures looking at how buildings could be better in many ways. The way in which they've got to be now better is in terms of reducing carbon emissions and making for safe workspaces.
Okay.
That's what I really felt compelled to say.
Well, thanks for sharing that thought. John, we're going to bring Professor Feltmate back in here. So we touched briefly on solar panels. What are some other ways or ideas we should be exploring when it comes to dealing with the emissions from buildings, as John's been pointing out?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's good to hear from John, number one. Number two, there's really two elements to energy efficiency within the context of buildings. Number one is for existing buildings, making sure that the energy envelope of the building itself, the structure itself, is tight. You know, what can we do through making sure that doors, windows are properly sealed, that we don't have leakages, in exhaust vents, that we don't have excess leakages. There are good efforts that can be engaged by way of audits to look at actually where is the energy leaking from buildings, and then what are the corrective measures to take, and that's for existing buildings. And to a large extent, that has been pursued in the country. And then the other area is simply as we build new buildings, we want to make sure that they're, that they put all the modern features that we can, that exist in reference to lowering the greenhouse gas, the carbon footprint of those buildings. And, there are different designations that you have for buildings now as platinum, gold, and so forth, LEED certified. And there's a whole gradient of things you can put in place to give you the higher level rating for new building design in particular, that increasingly so tenants of buildings are asking about. They want to know that the building they're occupying has a limited carbon footprint, and you want to be able to illustrate that.
To what degree is that enforced or, made part of the rules of these LEED certified buildings, though?
It's not. It's pretty much all voluntary right now. But increasingly so, companies, corporations, businesses that are held accountable for their carbon footprints, particularly, I would say in the last 3 years, it's really taken hold. If you're talking to law firms or head offices of different, it might be a company in the mining sector or whatever it might be, accounting firms, etc. When they're touting the need for energy efficiency and to be practitioners of sustainable development, they have to make sure that they're walking the talk. And a big component of walking the talk themselves is asking what is the sustainability of the business, of the building that we are occupying as office space.
Okay, John, thanks for getting in touch. We're going to move along to Sydney. Jenny is on the line. Hi, Jenny.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for this conversation. I have a question about educating both provincial and municipal governments on some of the updated natural ways for flood mitigation, using existing infrastructure and repairing wetlands. I found here in Sydney, we had a project where we had a lot of community support once we started educating people on doing things differently, but it just seems like the governments are still using very old practices.
What's an example, Jenny, of that education and the outcome, or I guess the result of sort of suggesting other ways of doing things? What are you talking about specifically?
I think looking more about we had the Blair Trail Forest here, and there were some really damaging floods coming through there, and we've been working with the municipal government, and I think also now the provincial, in terms of not just putting in berms and holding ponds, but looking at, what are we doing with the trees and the wetland area to help reestablish that, to take care of the flooding. And it seemed like it was sort of a foreign idea to a lot of folks.
Interesting, because I know obviously there are a lot of provincial and municipal governments that are paying attention to this. Professor Feltmate, what are your thoughts on the fact that there just needs to be more education at those levels of government?
Yeah, so this is an area I'm deeply involved in right now, by the way. It is in reference to the utility of natural infrastructure to not only mitigate flood risk, but to function as an agent for carbon capture and sequestration, to support biodiversity, to limit the dispersion of pollutants in ecosystems, and just aesthetically, it's just more pleasing to have natural infrastructure than not. So one of the primary mandates we're focusing on for Canada right now, in new standards and guidelines coming out in reference to how we build new residential communities, for example, is to retain the natural infrastructure we have to a much greater degree than would have happened historically, and also looking at restoring that which we've lost. So and it is quite correct that this concept, even 5 or 10 years ago, if you met with senior people in government, it kind of got a lukewarm response at best. But retaining biodiversity, natural infrastructure space for flood mitigation, it's really taken off now in terms of receptivity for politicians. And so it's being written into, and we're doing a lot more work to even quantify the cost savings associated with having natural infrastructure, let's say upstream of a community, versus built infrastructure. And we're getting very good numbers now to show the actual dollar savings realized by having natural infrastructure upstream versus having something paved over, metaphorically.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that too, that I really don't know the answer to? Like, how much does removing invasive plants and species and trying to restore the natives also play a role in maybe some climate change mitigation in terms of restoring the biodiversity there? And is there work being done in terms of invasives and natives within that?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. By the time invasives, if you can work with invasives at a local level, so if you see purple loosestrife entering into a marsh somewhere or whatever within close proximity to an area that you otherwise don't want to see it, you can make the effort to go in there and remove it and probably be successful. But by the time an invasive species shows up on a radar screen, chances are it's infiltrated the ecosystem well beyond anything that you can gain direct access to. So addressing problems with invasive species is very, very problematic. Can you solve the problem locally? The answer is yes. But boy, oh boy, once invasives are in a system, from an ecosystem dynamics perspective, very, very difficult to get them out.
Okay, Jenny. Well, thanks for posing those questions.
Thank you.
Let's jump to Halifax. Paul is on the line. Hi, Paul.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about soil health, and carbon.
Well, we're basically we look at new tilling practices that make it such that the means by which you engage tillage doesn't release as much carbon into the atmosphere versus not. And it's an area that I would say is drawn a fair bit of attention over maybe the last 5 or 10 years or something like that. So more and more so, we're looking at tillage practices that make it such that we're not discharging as much carbon into the atmosphere as otherwise would occur.
And the discharge, but also the sequestration, like retaining carbon, like pulling carbon out of the air. Why I ask is, I just watched a Netflix show last night, and I wanted to see if it was actually legit. It's called Kiss the Ground, and they talked about a deep drawdown program. I was wondering if that is something we should be pursuing or not.
In my opinion, yes. And I think right now we should be looking at changes in tillage methods that can help sequester carbon. We should be looking at almost, aligning with the previous call that when we talk about retaining natural infrastructure to mitigate flood risk, we should also be looking at it as a source for carbon capture and sequestration. So we need to think about natural infrastructure as not a decoration on the landscape, but that it actually offers utility to sequester carbon, mitigate flood risk, support biodiversity, and attach more value to it than we overall do right now.
All right. Well, Paul, thanks for calling. And Kiss the Ground on Netflix. Okay, maybe I'll take a look at that. Let's jump along to, just across the harbor from Halifax in Dartmouth. Kevin's on the line. Hi, Kevin.
Hi there.
Hi. Do you have a question today?
Yeah, and I'm really happy that someone else had brought up the idea of flood mitigation, especially with, the Dartmouth lakes and things like that. But I'd like to do something a little bit different, and I'll try to keep it specific because it can get broad. But for work, I kind of run a general repair business, and there's a lot of things that just their entire economy is designed around kind of a consumer kind of throw out kind of society. And I'd like to ask the professor a little bit more about what his opinions and what he thinks that Canada or the province can do in terms of enacting broader right to repair laws, which is something that has a very positive impact, not just environmentally, but for the economy as well.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. If you could just say it got garbled there a little bit. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry. I'm just basically wanting to bring up the idea of a stronger right to repair laws.
Yeah, I just simply, to be honest, I just don't know enough about the topic to give a meaningful answer. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna pass on that one.
Okay, Kevin, what was just on your thoughts to the right to repair laws? Then obviously that would produce less waste, and whatever you have in your appliances or whatever else would last longer, and less going out at the end of the roadway.
Yeah, not just necessarily appliances, but everything we use, I think there's definitely a government role that can be played in closing the loop, refurbishing, repair. Mm-hmm. And in some, especially a few European countries, a right to repair law would be that when you buy a thing, an item, you own it completely. You have the ability to repair it. So some corporations, say cell phone companies, say Apple, will have rules upon what you can do with the item that you can own. So if I go in to repair an item, a lot of times what keeps me from being able to do that is that company keeps all of their schematics, their parts close to the chest, proprietary. Mm-hmm. They may not even sell the part. Or in even more nefarious terms, they might design an item to fail after a few years so that you'll buy a new one.
Right. Well, we've talked about right to repair laws before on the program, and it's probably something we'll come back to revisit. So thanks for your thoughts on the matter today, Kevin, and stay tuned. We'll touch base on that one down the road, I think.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's jump along to Halifax. Mary Chisholm is on the line. Hi, Mary.
Oh, hi.
Hi. What do you think about green ideas we should be adopting?
Well, I'm really glad you're doing this on the show today. We've lost sight of the climate change problem. I would like to talk about local agriculture. When talking with people, I find people don't get the difference between the fossil carbon cycle and the biogenic or the biological carbon cycle. And there's so many great young farmers right now in Nova Scotia who are working with, good soil principles and really understanding the relationship between what they grow and the soil health, and especially the relationship of grazing and ruminants to soil health. And, understanding more about that agriculture could help us in two ways. It can mitigate carbon release because cows don't eat coal or oil. They eat grass, and that just keeps getting recycled. And it could also improve food security, which is going to be an issue when things start to break down a bit with carbon change. So I was wondering if your guest would care to talk about the difference between the fossil carbon cycle, and that's why we are where we are now, and the biologic carbon cycle.
Okay. Well, Professor Feltmate, we just have about a minute left. Do you want to venture in onto that one?
Well, I'll hit the high point there. Most notably, though, is food security, and food security is, in my opinion, going to be one of the factors that's going to. It is now, and increasingly so in the future, is going to be very problematic. And what we're seeing now is that in locations around the world that are either too hot or too dry, or being flooded out on the reverse end of the equation, these factors are impacting food supply en masse, particularly in coastal regions around the world that are going to affect large migrations of people. So food security as a topic is being impacted by climate change. Is it drawing attention? The answer is yes. Will it have to more so? The answer is also yes. And it's going to affect large-scale dislocations of people moving on the by order of millions, not just thousands.
It's interesting. Cows get cast in two different lights, too. Mary is suggesting one benefit, but also heavily criticized for the amount of methane that they produce as well. So when it comes to climate change, they're a point of topic for a lot of people. Mary, I'm so sorry, but we are out of time, so we're going to have to leave it at that for today. But thank you very much for calling, and thank you to all of our listeners who got in touch today. Robust discussion for sure. Professor Feltmate, thanks for your time as well.
Oh, well, you're very welcome.
And Blair Feltmate, our guest today, he's the head of the Intact Center of Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. He's also the former chair of a federal expert panel on climate change adaptation and resilience. If you didn't get on today, you still want to have your say, you can do that. Simply leave a message at 1-800-565-5463, and our email is marnoon@cbc.ca.